Good afternoon. I'm Dan DeRose with 19 News Now, coming to you from our digital desk. Let's talk COVID, flu, and RSV. Haven't had to do one of these probably since last February. That's a good thing for the time span, but maybe not such a great thing if you're one of the people that's being impacted. And we know it's having an impact. I can be honest with you, here in our own newsroom over the last 2-3 weeks, we have seen an increased amount of my coworkers having to call out sick. And from what we're hearing, this is not just our newsroom. This is a Northeast Ohio thing. We can look at the CDC reports that are coming out. Ohio has been elevated to a level of high when it comes to respiratory illnesses. That also includes Indiana, Pennsylvania, Kentucky. And we're only giving you these because you may have traveled for the holiday season. Then in the very high category of spread is Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, at least within our region. Just in the past week, nationwide, there's been a 12% increase in people showing up to the emergency room with COVID or RSV or the flu, and unfortunately an increase in 10% of the deaths. Now, the overwhelming majority of those have been people who are already battling other diseases, for example, cancer, which we have known from the beginning in COVID. Those are the people who get impacted the most. We're going to bring back in, even though we haven't heard from her in quite a while because there hasn't been a need, Dr. Amy Edwards, infectious disease expert with the University of Hospitals here in Cleveland. Dr. Edwards, I should say it's good to have you back, but boy, we wish we didn't have to have you back. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
Let's talk about and what's going on in Northeast Ohio. As an infectious disease doctor here, what are we seeing in the last week, in the last 2 weeks? What is the hospital seeing, and what are the numbers perhaps?
We're seeing is pretty typical for what we often see this year, at this time of year, excuse me, is, over the last month or so, we've been battling RSV, particularly in our young kids, and then in our older adults or people with like COPD or other medical conditions. And then we always, around this time of year, as we come into true winter out of late fall, we start to see increases in influenza and other respiratory viruses. COVID, of course, has been going on basically since school started back in September, although those numbers are going up as well. And so this is always the time of year where we really start to struggle because RSV is still high, and then those other viruses start to kind of also take off, especially after all the gatherings from the season. And we just start to see more and more admissions from those other ones while we're still dealing with all the admissions from RSV. And so it really can get tight around this time of year and for the next like 4 to 6 weeks as we kind of battle, multiple respiratory viruses simultaneously.
We really haven't seen this since last February. Where do you put this? How do you rank this as far as outbreaks of COVID and RSV that we've had in the past, where we know that resources were stretched extremely thin, down to few beds being left available? We're not there yet, I'm assuming, or are we?
No, we're not there yet. This is a bad season, but it's not last year bad. Um, for those of you who remember my interviews from last year was rough. But this year's kind of more normal bad as opposed to last year bad. We do have bed space. We have some days where it gets tight. That happens during respiratory season, especially on the pediatric side. So that's happening, but it's not happening to the level that it happened last year. So we're in still kind of like normal bad as opposed to bad, if that makes sense.
It does, I think, in layman's terms. I'm sure we won't find that in any CDC journals, but it gives the rest of us context. One of the reasons we know that we're seeing, whether it's flu, whether it's COVID, this sort of rise is because of the amount of people who have decided to skip vaccinations, whether it's the flu. I can tell you this season, according to the CDC, just about 44% of adults have gotten the flu vaccine this year, and that number drastically drops when we talk about the COVID booster / new vaccine at just 19% of adults deciding to get this year's shot. What does that say to you about the people willing to get the shot and now the people now dealing with becoming sick?
Well, what I would say is that it was really disappointing. It wasn't surprising. It was quite frankly about what I expected. It was really disappointing. This was the year, you didn't mention it, but there's also the new RSV vaccine that came out for older people. This was the year where we really could have just stopped doing this every winter. We had the ability to block the three big COVID, RSV, and flu. We have vaccines for all three. And we could have really made a difference in the number of people who died in the winter, the number of people who had to spend some part of the winter in the hospital or very ill at home. But it just didn't happen. People chose not to get vaccinated. And so we're right back where we start. We didn't need to be here. We could be having a very different discussion about how the hospital has never been this empty in the middle of respiratory season. We could have had a very different talk today. But unfortunately, with the way things have gone over the last several years, with rising mistrust in the medical community, rising mistrust of vaccines, this is where we are. We have the tools to prevent this, but people choose not to use them, and so instead they choose to get sick or to take the risk to get sick, and yeah, so here we are.
And we're not going to get too technical on the strains because we know now COVID has sort of split off multiple times. Where are we with COVID? What is dominant? And is it making people sicker? That's always the question people want to know. Okay, this round of COVID, is it making people sicker? Are you staying sick longer? What are you seeing?
So, as you mentioned, yes, there are multiple strains of COVID in circulation. So we don't really there's not like one dominant strain, or if a strain is dominant, it might get up to 20% of the cases are from this one strain. That's not really, we're used to back in the day where we talked about the alpha strain or the delta strain, where like 95% of the cases came from this one strain. That those days are gone. It's much more in line with, say, like influenza or other viruses, where we're used to having three, four, five strains, co-circulating. What we see is just that, multiple strains co-circulating. Actually, all the strains that are in circulation are a very good match for this year's COVID vaccine. And early studies indicate that the current vaccine provides very good protection from currently circulating strains, which is great for those who would like to go get the vaccine. It is a great match this year. As far as clinical, there doesn't appear to be much clinical difference between the strains, and maybe a little variation here or there, but nothing significant.
As far as how sick it's making people, is this
Mhm.
similar to
Yeah.
Alpha and Delta? It's all pretty much the same?
No, all of the Omicron subvariants are very different from the COVID we used to know. So there's a couple of major differences that we see with the Omicron subvariants. One is it doesn't appear to be quite as inflammatory. So you'll remember back when you and I were best friends and we spent all our time together, a pediatric condition called MIS-C, multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children associated with COVID-19. Since we made the switch to Omicron last year, that syndrome has disappeared. We've not seen a case since. We also see less long COVID, which we think is also an inflammatory condition. Not that long COVID doesn't exist, we just see a lot less of it. In the adult population, Omicron appears to be slightly less virulent than Alpha and Delta. So we see lower rates of hospitalization and lower mortality rates. That doesn't appear to be as true for children. Children have always had lower hospitalization rates and lower mortality rates, but it seems to hold steady with Omicron rather than decreasing the way it did in the adult population. Um, so it's not the same COVID that we all knew and loved back in the day, but there's not a lot of difference between all the strains that are currently circulating are all Omicron subvariants. And so the variations are genetic, but they don't appear to be clinical, if that makes sense.
It does. From a scientific standpoint, it has been fascinating, not always a pleasant fascination, but fascinating to watch this just expand out. And as you have said a number of times, this virus is trying to survive. And so that's why it keeps splitting off. As we keep trying to fight it, it's going to try and be survival of the fittest and try and evade everything we're trying to do. Dr. Edwards, we always appreciate your advice and your expertise here. I'm going to give you the final input here as people are battling this, as we've just come out of the holidays. Travel is going to be a little less. Final word for people on what to do, precautions, and what we're going to do moving forward.
My final words would be that it's never too late to get vaccinated. The COVID vaccine is available for adults and kids. The flu vaccine is available for adults and kids, and the RSV vaccine is available for pregnant women and older adults. These vaccines work. They are safe. I will put a personal plug in. I got my own children vaccinated. So for those who think I'm in the pay of Big Pharma and I'm lying about it, I'm not. I put my money where my mouth is, and my kids are fully vaccinated against COVID and influenza, as am I and my husband. And I will say I have never had COVID. We are a COVID-free household. Masks are always a great idea if you're feeling unwell. Keep those germs to yourself and cover up, or stay home if you're able to. Cover your cough, wash your hands, and just try to be good neighbors. Try not to get your friends and family sick.
That staying home seems to be a big one, especially when we start talking about offices and people coughing and sneezing, and that's effectively what spreads throughout an office. That was my headline today, are your coworkers dropping like flies, and we have seen that. Dr. Amy Edwards with University Hospital's infectious disease expert, we certainly appreciate the time. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully we don't have to talk to you too soon in the future.
I would very much enjoy not having to talk to you about anything major going on. That would be lovely.
Absolutely. Take care. That's going to wrap it up for us. We just wanted to give you an idea, because we are hearing from so many people, oh, half our office is sick. Oh, we've got so many people out because of either the flu, the COVID, or the RSV. This is in the past. I can remember when the CDC, when Dr. Bruce Vanderhoff, the head of the Ohio Department of Health, would warn about the big three-headed monster. Well, it's back again, and it looks like we're going to be dealing with this. And as you heard from Dr. Edwards, had we just gotten people vaccinated, this probably wouldn't have gotten to this stage, and we'll have to see where it goes from here. If we have any other breaking news, it'll be here on our digital platforms. Otherwise, our 3 o'clock news, just about an hour and a half away, and that starts 3.5 hours of news and weather on Channel 19. Until then, I'm Dan DeRose with 19 News. Have a great afternoon.
19 News is everywhere. Download our CTV apps and follow us on social media @Cleveland 19 News.